Okay, Craig, you're on.
And in theory, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about color because color is an important compositional element, or the lack of color if you're working in black and white. So sometimes, though, good color goes bad. So that's better. So topics for tonight. I've got some boring front end stuff talking about color basics, how color is created. A little further down the rabbit hole with color spaces and device profiles, because all of that is somewhat important to have at least a conversational knowledge when we get into how to avoid problems in the camera or in editing or ultimately in printing. And eventually the goal is what you see on the monitor is what you get when you either make a print or when you share an image with someone else, that they will see the same thing that you saw on your monitor. That's the ideal. So we probably all know that digital sensors record the colors in the scene in terms of red, green, and blue. And you've probably heard the term RGB, which refers to red, green, and blue. And if you look at the photography color wheel, you'll see the three primary colors of red, green, and blue making up a triangle. And in between the red, green, and blue are the complementary colors of magenta, cyan, and yellow. So these are the six basic colors that color photography is based on. And that was true, by the way, back in the film days as well. When you were doing color processing, you worked with those same six colors. So white is just the combination in equal parts of all three of the primary colors. So if you start with a black screen and you apply some red light and some green light and some blue light, where they add together in equal parts, you get white. So white is all colors. Black is no color. When you print, you're printing on a piece of white paper. So what we really need to do is subtract colors from the white paper. And that's done using those complementary in-between colors of cyan, magenta, and yellow. So where the printer puts down yellow ink, what it's really doing is subtracting blue. Where it puts down magenta, it's subtracting green. Where it puts down cyan, it's subtracting red. And because it doesn't usually work out perfectly, most printers also include a black ink to help fill in the gaps to get a good pure black. But if you want to impress your nerdy friends, RGB is additive, CMYK is subtractive color. So in the camera, your camera is recording red, green, and blue. And if you have a 20 megapixel camera, you have 20 million photo sites that record red or green or blue, unless you have a fancy Sigma Foveon sensor. Each photo site has a little micro lens and then a little micro filter, so that each photo site is only recording one of those three colors. So it really starts out, your image really starts out as a mosaic of just red, green, and blue. And in order to turn it into a full color image, the software needs to look at every one of these photo sites and look at the surrounding neighbors and try to figure out, well, I know this is the amount of green at this point. How much red should there be and how much blue should there be? So it has to do some interpolation to figure out how much of each color goes into each photo site to translate it or demosaic it, you may have heard that term, from a mosaic of red, green, and blue into an RGB file that now is a full color file. So that's what demosaicing does. If you're shooting in a JPEG workflow, shooting JPEG in the camera, all that happens inside the camera. Your camera exposes the sensor, it demosaics and applies a white balance. So that gets kind of baked into the file. It'll do some sharpening. It will compress it and store it as a JPEG and then save that onto the memory card so that you can eventually copy that to your computer. In a raw workflow, you expose the sensor and those raw values from those photo sites, the reds, greens, and blues, get saved onto a card in a raw file. And then after you copy it to the computer, you can demosaic it and apply the white balance in a program like Lightroom. and do whatever sharpening and compression, whatever else you want, and eventually save it on your computer as a JPEG or a TIFF or PSD or whatever you want. And of course, there's advantages both ways. JPEG is simple, gives you nice, small, easy to manage files. RAW gives you more flexibility if you enjoy playing with the flexibility. That either approach is a good approach. So after demosaicing, every pixel then has a red, a green, and a blue. And usually we would combine them into a triad to say this pixel, for instance, is 141 red, 100 green, and 57 blue. And you'll frequently see it written this way. So seems simple. Why is it complicated? Well, the first problem that we have is that there's no frame of reference. That just by themselves, these RGB numbers are actually meaningless. That you don't know 141 of what? Of 255? Well, what's 255? What color red is 255? How bright is it? How saturated is it? How do I know how this 141 fits into the whole scheme of things? It's a little bit like if you ask what's the temperature outside and the answer is 20 degrees, you still don't know whether it's warm or cold because that could be 20 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. And those are very different numbers. That obviously 20 degrees Fahrenheit is much colder than 20 degrees Celsius. But that measurement scale provides a frame of reference so that we can infer meaning into that number of 20 degrees. Well, the same is true in digital photos, and the thing that provides a frame of reference is called a color space. And so if we say this pixel is 141, 157 in the sRGB color space, now we know exactly what color that is. We know it's this combination of values, and we know from the information in the sRGB color space exactly what color that is. So now we have a fighting chance of all being right with the world. So color spaces define kind of all of the possible colors that we might see. The world contains actually all visible colors or the visible spectrum. And that's you could think of as being the largest spectrum or gamut of colors. Monitors and printers, unfortunately, can't display all the colors that we can see. There are no monitors, there are no printers that can print the entire visual spectrum. A color space then defines what is the range of colors that are available within this envelope or this package or this picture. And generally those are defined relative to a standard spectrum such as the CIE LAB with a D50 illuminant. The color gamut is the range of colors that are available. You might hear somebody talk about an out of gamut color. What they're talking about is a color that is outside the range of what's available within that color space. And generally bad things will happen when you're trying to represent out of gamut colors in a smaller color space. Some of the common color spaces that we use as photographers, sRGB, which is really the best match for JPEGs, monitors, and online printing. Adobe RGB 1998 is a little bit larger color space, encompasses more colors, and it's a good match for a good inkjet printer. It's broader than sRGB. ProPhoto RGB is the largest commonly used color space. It's a very wide, almost encompasses the entire visible spectrum, but it is beyond what can be displayed and what can be printed. So RGB is a very large color space. ProPhoto RGB is a very large color space, I should say. Adobe RGB 1998 is a little bit smaller, and sRGB is the smallest of the three, but it's the one that will keep you out of trouble because it doesn't have any colors that you can't see, and it doesn't have colors that can't be reproduced elsewhere. For instance, Facebook, if you upload almost any image to Facebook, it will convert it into their proprietary version of sRGB. They used to use the sRGB, now they use kind of their own proprietary version. Online printing services will assume, if you send them a picture, they'll either require or in some cases assume that it's an sRGB. And if you send them a photo that's in one of these other color spaces and they assume the numbers in there are sRGB, you're going to get wonky colors. And as I mentioned before, it's a good match. Most reasonably good monitors can handle pretty much most or all of the sRGB color space. So if you're debating which one to use, my recommendation is always use sRGB unless you have a really good monitor, know how to convert from sRGB from and to these other color spaces. And generally going from sRGB to a larger color space, you won't have problems. Going the other direction, because there will be colors in these larger color spaces that you can't reproduce in the smaller color space. Going down can create problems. But,
Craig,
yeah.
excuse me, do you want to hold off on questions or can you?
You can ask them anytime.
Okay, thanks. If I'm shooting in RAW, is that independent of color space?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Yes.
what I hoped.
Yep. A raw photo doesn't really have a color space. Every manufacturer's raw file has an algorithm of how they've assigned the colors from the analog to digital converter. And so programs like Photoshop and Lightroom have more or less reverse engineered the numbers in a raw file from a Canon or a Nikon, so they know how to demosaic it. And that's where the color space gets applied.
So when I'm shooting my Nikon camera and other Nikon users, and I'm sure Canon, Sony, there are settings for me to set the color space, but I assume that's for the in-camera processing of JPEGs.
Yes, that will affect the JPEG preview that you see on the back of the camera, and it may affect the embedded JPEG preview that goes with the raw file.
Okay, thanks very much.
So as you might have gathered, in these three different color spaces that we're talking about, the same RGB values, in this case 67, 96, 169, is actually three different shades of blue. It's this shade of blue in sRGB, and likewise it's different in Adobe and ProPhoto RGB. And turning that around the other way, the same shade of blue is available in all three color spaces, but it requires a different set of numbers. So if we want to translate from sRGB into Adobe RGB 1998, we have to translate these three numbers into these three numbers. And fortunately, that's what color management does, is it does the translation from one color space to another. So that we don't really have to worry about the numbers, we just have to keep the path correct. So images from your camera eventually will always have a color space assigned. If you're shooting JPEG, it gets assigned in the camera like we just talked about. Most cameras, I believe, will probably default to sRGB. If they give you a choice, they may give you a choice between sRGB and Adobe RGB 1998. As we already said, you want to choose sRGB to stay out of trouble. If you're shooting RAW, that doesn't get assigned until you go through the demosaicing process on the computer in Lightroom or whatever you're using for a RAW converter.
Craig?
Yeah.
Can you go back a slide? There's something there. So if all three color spaces have the triads, how does the other ones have more available colors? Do the numbers go greater than 255 or?
No, they will still go 0 to 255, but they squeeze more colors into that same range. So
I'm just not, the math is just not adding up for me.
well, and that's an interesting point. The Adobe RGB is not a whole lot bigger, so you can squeeze the Adobe RGB colors into an 8-bit color space, 0 to 255. Once you get to ProPhoto RGB, because there are so many colors available in that color space, you can run into banding problems if you try to pack those all into just 256 divisions. So if you want to work in ProPhoto RGB, you really need to work in 16-bit color in order to have enough precision of the different colors in order to not have issues with banding.
Okay, so it does really have more values than
Yes.
the 3. Okay.
Yeah, and it'll have somewhat more saturated colors and different combinations of colors.
Okay.
And that's where you can run into problems if you're working, especially if you're working in ProPhoto. You'll have colors in your image that you can't see on your monitor. And if you try to down convert into sRGB for printing, for instance, the algorithms that do the conversion have to figure out what to do with those colors that don't have a corresponding color in sRGB. And generally, nothing good will happen in that conversion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So a color space defines the range of available colors, and it's kind of a universal thing. In other words, sRGB is always sRGB, and it's a universal definition relative to the CIE LAB definition of the, from the visible color spectrum. A device profile looks a lot like a color space. In fact, they're both stored as a .icc or .icm file. So people tend to use them interchangeably. The difference is in intent for how it's intended to be used. A color space defines the range of colors available. A device profile describes specifically how to translate from, for instance, sRGB to a Dell UltraSharp 27-inch U2722D monitor, or an Epson P700 printer printing on Epson premium luster paper. That's what a device profile takes care of, is that conversion from this color standard to this specific implementation of color on this hardware. So device profile, you can think of as being device specific, but it's really just a way to translate from one color space to another. So just like we could have the same tone with different RGB values in different color spaces, we can have the same tone in sRGB. We can translate to a different set of numbers in order to get that same tone out of this printer paper combination. And if we have a monitor profile, we can translate to get that same tone to display on this monitor using this specific color profile. So that's what color management does behind the scenes, is translate this color into these numbers for display on a different device. Are you asleep yet? So one more detail to trip us up is color modes or color models. You'll hear them used interchangeably. We've been talking about RGB, which is a color mode or a color model. In cameras, monitors, generally most image files are going to be in an RGB color model. CMYK is a different color model, and it's generally used for printing on offset printing presses. If you're sending files off to be printed on a printing press, they may require that you send them in CMYK rather than RGB. And so that's a conversion you can do in Photoshop. Kind of the universal color model is LAB. Sometimes people call it lab, but it really stands for luminance, A channel, and B channel, where the A channel is red and green, and the blue channel is blue and yellow. And really, most software works internally in the LAB color space. And it's probably more than just a coincidence that the tint slider is red and green, and the temperature slider is blue and yellow. So when you're working with your color conversion in a raw file, those sliders that you're using for tint and temperature are really A and B sliders in an LAB color space. And just as you can have different color modes or color models, each one of those models can have its own set of color spaces. So RGB has common color spaces like sRGB, Adobe RGB, ProPhoto RGB. CMYK also has color spaces like the SWAP V2, Graycal, Snap. These are color spaces within the CMYK mode. LAB also has different color spaces. One of the most common is the CIE D50 lab, where the D50 is the illuminant. So of these, RGB can be large or can be small. It can encompass nearly all the visible colors or a restricted set. CMYK, unfortunately, which is what you need to put color on paper, is the smallest color gamut. It's smaller than sRGB. LAB is generally the largest, and it will encompass all visible colors, sometimes even plus a few more. So we have kind of a color funnel going from the real world where we have all the colors in the visible spectrum, and we kind of compress those down into a camera, and then we compress those down into a file that we're going to send to either a monitor or a printer. So what we have to manage is this compression going from the real world down to the final image. And again, color management is what takes care of that. And it can seem like a losing battle, but you just have to remember from the beginning, color will never be perfect. And digital processes are generally designed for pretty color and not accurate color. Accurate color is a whole different presentation.
So can your cameras see all the visible colors?
Generally, yes. That especially the more modern cameras, and in the last 5 or 10 years, they can see a lot of colors with the red, green, and blue. In fact, most of them will even have a filter, for instance, to block some of the infrared, to keep too many of the UV and infrared colors from coming through.
Does it matter if your camera has a crop sensor or a full sensor as to what colors or the
No.
amount of colors it can see?
Nope.
No? Okay.
Nope. It's the crop sensor is really just a sensor that's been cut down, but everything else is the same.
Okay. Thanks.
So color management is the tool that kind of works behind the scenes to do the translations for us, with those two goals in mind. First, to help you get color that you're happy with, hopefully color that you're ecstatic with. And secondly, more importantly, is to get predictable results so that when you print or share, the picture comes out on your iPad or your iPhone or your printer or the printer at Costco looking like you expected it to look. You avoid surprises. So now we get into applying all this knowledge that we've just picked up on color spaces and color profiles. The goal is to select a consistent color space to work with. And as you may have guessed, I recommend using sRGB throughout the process because it avoids conversion problems and surprises later on if you're working in kind of the least common denominator. You want to standardize your monitor because most monitors out of the box are too bright and too blue because that looks cool on the showroom floor. And that will vary a lot from brand to brand, monitor to monitor. Macs are better than a lot of the standalone monitors. Generally, the less expensive the monitor, the brighter it's going to be because they're trying to make it look better than it is. And then lastly, we want to talk about proper settings for printing, which is probably what you came for in the first place. So capture, if you're shooting in RAW, you're already good to go. You don't need to do anything different. If you're shooting in JPEG, you may want to look in the manual, find out where this color space setting is, and ensure that you're using sRGB so that you're getting a good standard to work with further down the line. So capture is easy. There are some color settings in Lightroom, and I apologize, these are a little bit on the small side, but if you go to Edit Preferences, there's a setting for external editing, and you'll want to make a couple settings there that you'll want to check. The file format, generally you'll want to choose either PSD or TIFF because those are not a compressed format. I always use PSD, but then I'm always using Photoshop. If you're using other editors, you may want to use TIFF rather than PSD to have a little bit more universal use. Color space, you want sRGB, and you probably want 8-bit for your color depth. If you're using Lightroom and doing all of your heavy editing in Lightroom, by the time you take it to Photoshop or somewhere else for editing, you probably already are close enough on your color that if you stay in an 8-bit color space, you'll do fine. And the resolution is at this point absolutely meaningless. In Photoshop, if you go to edit color settings, there are some settings there for the default working space. And again, you want to be consistent. If you're using sRGB from Lightroom to Photoshop, you probably want to use sRGB as the default in Photoshop. And that will just keep everything consistent and playing nicely together. Unless you frequently work in CMYK or these other color spaces, you don't need to worry about them. Color policy, you probably want to be sure that you're preserving any embedded profiles. So if somebody gives you a ProPhoto RGB or an Adobe RGB file, you want to preserve that embedded profile and not start changing it. So those would be the settings in Photoshop. When you're exporting from Lightroom, in the export dialog, there's a setting for color space. Again, we want that to be sRGB. And that will be the same whether you're exporting as a JPEG or a TIFF or whatever. You probably want to use sRGB. And if you're doing a save as from Photoshop, there's a checkbox whether or not to include the color space as either a tag, or in many cases, it will include the complete color profile because it's not a very big file. So frequently when you save a JPEG, it will not only be tagged as an sRGB image, it will include a copy of the sRGB color space that it used so that there's no confusion. It is possible to save an untagged image, and then you get an image that has RGB values and no frame of reference to know what they represent. So you want to avoid that. So this kind of brings us to device color management. And the goal is that you have an image in a photo file on your computer, and whatever those colors are, you want to see them accurately on the monitor, and you want them to print accurately on your printer. And it's that color management that can apply a monitor profile to translate the colors from the source image to the monitor and from the source image to the printer. So that whatever number in the RGB color space is in the image, it will get translated into appropriate numbers that will give you the same color on both the monitor and the printer. So there's really two steps with a monitor. There's calibration and there's profiling, and you do them separately. Calibration is really just getting the monitor to kind of standard values, and that's primarily brightness and contrast. And anyone can and should do this with their monitor, whether you're on a laptop or a workstation, you can calibrate your monitor and you don't need any special hardware. Profiling, on the other hand, is when you create that custom device-specific profile for your monitor, and that does require a piece of hardware called a colorimeter. It's important if you're doing a lot of printing. Most people don't have a colorimeter, therefore they don't do it. If you already have a colorimeter, you probably understand everything I'm presenting and more. If you don't have a colorimeter, you probably don't need one unless you're doing a lot of printing and having problems. But calibration, everybody should do. And the easy way to do that, and this file should be available in the show notes on YouTube and possibly elsewhere. Shirley can address that. But you can download this image that I created that has a grayscale going from pure black all the way up to pure white with a bunch of steps in between. And the way you use this is you display it on your monitor, and you should be able to see every one of the steps from black to white. Now, the way my printers work and the way my monitor works, What I have found works best for me is this first black band here needs to be just barely visible. If I just glance at it, I won't see it. But if I get close and look, I can see there's a little bit of a difference here between the first and the second dark band. And at the bright end, there should be a fairly visible difference between the lightest gray and then the pure white. And then you should be able to see every step in between. And as you look across the steps, you shouldn't see any differences in color. That on some monitors, you may see some, different color tones or color tints, depending on whether it's a dark gray or a light gray or a medium gray. The best way to use this is to print the file in a properly color managed printing process so that you have a good reference, that you know exactly what that file looks like on paper, and then adjust your monitor so that it represents how you see the paper print of this image. And that's kind of what color management is doing. This is just a crude way of doing it. We're adjusting what you see on the monitor to match what's in the file. So this is a good process for everybody to use to ensure that your monitor is not too bright or too dark. And the default is going to be to have it too bright, in which case you may not see all of the steps at the bright end, and you'll see too much differentiation at the dark end. If you're interested in calibration, that's where you use a colorimeter that you would actually hang over the front of your monitor, and software will display known colors, and it will create a device-specific profile just for your monitor. The second best choice is to adjust the colors. If you do make a print, you want to adjust your monitor to match the print. Don't try to adjust the printing to match the monitor. So if your monitor is too bright and too blue, you need to adjust the colors in your monitor, which you can either do by adjusting the monitor settings through the menu in the monitor, or there are typically some display settings in Windows where you can tweak the color and contrast of the display, which is what you may have to do on a laptop. But again, you want to match the monitor to a print, not the print to a monitor. There are some oddities that are worth mentioning. If you're on a Mac, it's kind of invisible to you. The operating system takes care of color management. If you're on Windows, Windows supports color management, but it doesn't really do color management. It has to be requested by the application. So that's where you can run into applications that are not particularly well managed. Fortunately, Lightroom and Photoshop are very well color managed. They can handle multiple monitors with multiple color profiles. They do a pretty good job. Not perfect, but a pretty good job. Many applications, though, are only partially color managed, that they may assume that the profile for monitor 1 is the profile for all monitors. And most importantly, the wallpaper is not color managed. So if you're in the habit of working in Lightroom or Photoshop and fine-tuning your image, and then you like it so much you save it as a wallpaper, just be aware that that wallpaper that you see in Windows is not color managed, and it may look a little bit different. So don't look at your wallpaper and then go back and try to adjust your file again. It's going to look different, very likely. Printing, inkjet printing versus commercial. And when I say commercial, this could be anything from Costco to Walmart to Walgreens to Bay Photo or White Wall Photo, low end or high end. They all use pretty much the same kind of process. And most of them are using some form of Fuji crystal archive paper. And it's a process where they use lasers or LEDs to expose photo paper and then run photo paper through chemicals in a traditional kind of wet process. The difference, there's two differences. One, inkjet printing can give you a wider color gamut, so it can produce more colors than any of the commercial printing. It's more archival, typically 100 to 200 years for color. You'll see numbers in the 300 to 400 years for black and white, where the The more traditional prints are going to be 40 years or less, some a lot less. Inkjet printing tends to be very predictable as long as you have the correct printer and paper combination. Commercial printing, it can vary quite a bit just depending on the condition of the chemicals. The chemicals in the paper is pretty well managed and controlled by the manufacturer, but through use, the chemicals become depleted and need to go through a replenishment process. You have to run control strips where you decide, do I have to add water? Do I add replenisher? What do I have to do to keep this processor in balance and maintain a very accurate temperature so that you get good repeatable results from hour to hour, from day to day. Depending on how well the printing lab is doing its process control, the colors may vary coming out of that printer from hour to hour as the temperature changes or as the concentration of the chemicals change. So it's a little bit less predictable. And most likely the more expensive prints are going to have a more process controlled process and a little bit more predictable results.
So what kind of printer is the commercial facilities using? You're talking to the left on inkjet printers.
Yep.
What are the commercial printers called? Laser?
It's it's probably a Cibachrome type printer where they're printing with either a laser or LED panel to expose photo paper from your digital image. And then it runs through chemical baths, just like the old-fashioned wet process chemistry for photos.
So you're talking places like the Walmarts, the Targets, the Walgreens.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
But not necessarily places like Bay Photo,
Yes.
Printique, things like that.
Yes. All of those.
All of those use a
All of
commercial
those.
printer.
They're probably using something like a Fuji Frontier light jet printer. Because it's fast and cheap. Inkjet is generally a lot slower. Some high-end printing places, boutique printers, and it's a service I provide, can offer inkjet printing. It's going to be more expensive generally, but it's more predictable.
Okay.
That if you've got the right profile and the right printer setup, a print I make on my inkjet printer today is going to look exactly like one I make next year or last year or 5 years from now.
I guess where I'm getting a little confused is lumping every commercial printer, be it Bay Photo and Walmart, into the same category.
They're using the same process. Bay Photo probably has a more controlled process.
Okay.
That they have, when you're printing that kind of high volume, process control becomes very important. Back in the 70s, I worked in a high volume portrait studio and we did our own color processing. And at least twice a day, if not more than that, when we were doing a lot of production, we would run test strips through the processors to test the chemical concentrations and see what we need to change to make sure, because you make a test print and you look at it and you say, oh, I need to add 5 points of red. So you go back and make another print, and it's an hour later before you run it through the processor again. If the processor has drifted, you don't know where you are.
Okay. I think, just for those that are local to St. George, if you send to Pure Art Printer for paper printing, I believe you're getting inkjet.
I believe that's correct. And yeah, their inkjet printing is generally very predictable.
Yeah.
The printing on metal, the dye sublimation, is not very predictable. Again, there's a lot of variables depending on temperature and humidity.
Yeah, that's an art.
Yeah. So when you're doing commercial printing, sometimes just the nature of the beast is going to cause some changes.
Okay.
And that's really the bottom line of this slide. Any commercial printer, unless you're getting inkjet prints made, there's some risk of it just drifting in the process and not coming out the way you expected it to. not because of anything you did wrong, just because their developer or their bleach was getting a little bit depleted. So in order to avoid problems, generally when you're sending something to a commercial printer, they want an sRGB color because their printers can only handle that color gamut. Some of the better sources like a Bay Photo will have color profiles that you can download so that you can soft proof. For instance, in Photoshop, you can turn on soft proofing and tell it to show you what this image will look like using this device profile. It's minimally useful. If you have a well-managed color process to start with, I believe it's generally not necessary. It is useful though to check for out of gamut color problems where you're squeezing down into a smaller color range and you're going to have some colors that are beyond what can be reproduced. But if you're using an sRGB workflow, that's almost never going to happen because sRGB can be reproduced in almost any one of these processes. So it just keeps you from having problems as you go further down the color funnel. For inkjet printing, it's a little bit different challenge. When you install the printer driver, generally it installs profiles for that manufacturer's papers. So if you install an Epson printer, it will install the drivers and the profiles for Epson papers. So, for instance, Epson Stylus Pro 3880 Premium Glossy Photo Paper.icc, that device profile will be installed when you install the printer driver. If you're using different brands of paper, you can usually go to that manufacturer's website and download profiles specific for that paper and your printer. For instance, the Harman Gloss Burita paper for an Epson 9900 using Photo Black ink. And you can download that and use it. And if you're really into exploring, if you have a colorimeter, you can create your own profiles for your own off-brand papers. Maybe you want to go get some watercolor paper or something different and create a profile. The most important thing when you're doing your own printing is you can either let Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever program is doing the printing, you can let it manage the color, or you can let the printer manage the color. And it's very important that one and only one of those two is managing the color. That nothing will get you into problems faster than having color management turned on in both the printer and the program on the computer. So if you want Photoshop to manage the color, then in Photoshop, you choose the correct printer profile. And in the printer driver, you turn off color management. So Photoshop is managing, and in the printer driver, it's turned off. If you want the printer to manage color, then you set the printer manages color in the Photoshop print window or Lightroom print window. And then you choose the correct paper in the printer driver when you're doing the printing. That way, only one of the two is going to be doing the color management. And what that looks like, the printer setup. This is the printer setup window for, I think, an Epson 3880. If you want Photoshop to manage the color, then in Epson printers, what you do is you select custom as the mode, and then you select off no color adjustment. So that turns off color management in the printer driver. And in Photoshop, you set Photoshop manages color on the print dialog, and then you select the printer profile that you want. In this case, it was the Harman Gloss Burita 3880. And then you also can choose a rendering intent. In this case, relative colorimetric was the rendering intent that I chose. Which of course brings up the question, well, now what's rendering intent? Rendering intent really just describes how the software is going to manage colors that are out of gamut, that are beyond what it can reproduce. Relative colorimetric basically properly maps everything that's in gamut, and colors that are out of gamut, it just kind of squeezes into the the nearest color that's in Gamut. So it can create some flat areas and some color clipping. Perceptual, on the other hand, tries to keep the color relationship the same, but it will change some of the in Gamut colors so that it kind of squeezes everything into Gamut, but it does so that everything may move a little bit. And just as an example, and I don't know how well this will translate from my screen to the video to your screen and so forth, but if you look at this image, and you can run into this mostly with flowers and sunsets, things where you have really brightly saturated colors. If you look in this area of the sky, you can see there's quite a bit of detail. That you can see some of the fine texture in the clouds and the yellow and the orange and the red here. If I squeeze this down into a smaller color gamut, such as printing it on a something that is a smaller color gamut, watch the colors here when I go to the next slide. See how they changed, and some of these areas became just flat. No longer have the fine detail. It just has one color. If I go back and forth, that's what happens when you have color clipping and out of gamut colors. But of course, if you're using sRGB, that'll almost never happen to you. That only happens if you're using one of those larger color spaces and then have to compress it for printing. So you can soft proof and judge whichever looks better. I've heard people say that skin tones tend to look better with relative colorimetric, but you do have to watch for color clipping. Saturated landscapes tend to do better with perceptual. So you can kind of do a rule of thumb of using relative colorimetric for everything except for landscapes, and then use perceptual. But again, if you're using an sRGB color space, you almost never have to worry about it. So either one will work. So in summary, use the sRGB color space to stay out of some of these pitfalls and problems. Calibrate your brightness and contrast on your monitor. And if printing is important, consider investing into a colorimeter for profiling. In general, what you want to do, though, is adjust your monitor to match a well-made print. In other words, what you see is what you should get, or turn that around, what you get is what you should have seen. And avoid getting into the trap of what I call offset printing, where you always make your image too bright so that it doesn't print too dark. That's a classic sign of having a monitor that's too bright. Rather than making your image too bright so that it doesn't print too dark, adjust your monitor so that it matches the print. And anytime you save or export for printing, use the sRGB color space. And then if you're already in the sRGB color space, you'll never have to worry about conversion problems. So that was too much information and not enough time. Are there any questions?
Craig, excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. I'm feeling a little less comfortable now after having talked to Mitch at Pure Art. I'm working on some edits of a raw file that I want him to make into a metal print. And he said, first, save it in the TIFF format. And he said, use Adobe RGB 1998 color space. Is that because his metal printer needs to function in that color space? Is that?
That's what he's used to working with. So, I would follow his advice. He's a professional. He knows what he's doing. And even if you check the box that says, don't review the color on these images, my experience is he's still going to review it and keep you out of trouble.
He said he always does. In fact, I've had problems with my prints coming out way dark, like when I sent to Costco when they used to do local printing.
Mm-hmm.
So I bought a colorimeter, maybe prematurely, but I think my color is accurate on my monitor, but my monitor is only capable of the sRGB color gamut. But yet he's saying, export it in TIFF, which I can, to the Adobe RGB color gamut. Am I going to run into problems that my monitor can't display that gamut, but he's asking me to send it to him in that.
You shouldn't, because going up from sRGB to Adobe RGB, even though Adobe RGB can display other colors, there won't be any of those other colors in your sRGB file. So,
but I'll be sending him an Adobe RGB file.
but but every color in there will also be compatible with sRGB.
Ah, okay.
So going from a small to a large, you can always find a match for a color going from small to large. It's only when you go from large to small that you can run into problems.
Yeah. So I'm comfortable that my colorimeter, as Mitch said, his monitor will see the same colors pretty close to what I see. But my brightness level, he suggested I crank that down to about 20% brightness on my monitor. And he said even if you don't ask, will look at the brightness when he sees it on his monitor. And based on his own experience, adjust it so it'll print on the metal, at the appropriate brightness.
Yeah, but you could be crushing blacks or clipping highlights if your monitor is too bright. So I agree with what Mitch said, is your monitor, it sounds like, is probably too bright.
Or was.
If you have a colorimeter, some colorimeters will give you guidance and let you set it to, like 85 or 90 candelas per square meter.
Right.
So you can actually, it'll actually read how bright your monitor is and let you adjust the brightness to whatever target you choose.
Oh, okay. And I am editing right now on my main monitor at 20% brightness, and it's visible after the colorimeter did its job. It used to be at 20%. It looks like I couldn't see anything on the monitor, but it's all pretty good now. But thanks for those responses.
Well, I just calibrated my monitor. And the first thing it asked me was, does your monitor have brightness control? And I said, yes. So you just put the thing on there, and then before it actually does any colors, it makes sure the brightness level is correct.
Yep.
So if you do that with yours, it would seem like you'd be okay.
Yeah, and that's kind of separating that calibration step and the profiling step. That, like I said, anybody can calibrate. Profiling requires the colorimeter, and you can calibrate more accurately if you have the colorimeter.
Right, and Bruce, you're right. I bought a Spider Pro X just a few months ago, and it tells you to reduce your brightness before you can let it calibrate the colors, and it shows candle power or whatever those things are.
Right. So your brightness should be okay then. So I would go with that as opposed to 20%, but I don't know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what Bruce is saying, if you use the colorimeter to set a desired brightness, then it's a more repeatable process than just turning it down to 20%.
Right, and I always have to remember to remove my sunglasses when I'm editing.
Yes. Yes, and don't edit with rose-colored glasses.
And always darken my room if I can. Great.
Any
So
other questions?
Yeah, I got a question. So this is all well and good when you have your own printer. So if you calibrate and you send it to the commercial place because you want a bunch of 4x6s, or you just want some small pictures, what do you do? How do you know what they're going to do?
You
Is it
hope
just trial and error?
Yeah, you hope that they have a pretty well-controlled process, but at the end of the day, you can't control what they do.
Right.
So you can have a perfectly calibrated process, and if the developer is getting exhausted in their machine, and stuff's going to start coming out different than you expected, or if their temperature control is off.
So, but to hedge our bets on that, the best thing to do is to calibrate your monitor.
Yes.
And then hope it turns out okay.
Yeah, if you've if you've calibrated your monitor and you're sending them a good file, you've got, you know, at least a fighting chance or better of getting good color back. If you
Okay.
don't calibrate your monitor, then, you know, you don't know what you're sending them. So you really can't predict what you're going to get back.
Okay.
So it's all about predictable results.
And I'm not so sure it's so much about the color when I like, okay, yeah, I'm like everybody else. I used to print at Costco now and then, and it always came back dark, even though I had a calibrated monitor.
Was it
And I was like, "Ugh."
and
Oh.
and again, the calibrating the brightness and profiling for colors are two different things.
Right, and I may not have been calibrating for brightness at that time.
That with the my experience has been over the last 20 years, starting out with the old CRT type monitors. You know, those things were all over the place. As we've gotten into more and more LCD monitors, there seems to be a lot less variation from product to product. Even the worst ones straight out of the box are not all that bad. So it is getting easier.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a different type of question. When you have something, when you send a file to be printed, why does it not come back the same size as what you sent in? No, I sent in a picture and I wanted an 8x10 and it cut part of one of the animals off.
It was probably the file you sent was not is not the same aspect ratio as an 8x10. That for instance, a 35 millimeter camera format is a 2x3 format. So it's a little bit longer and less high. If you're thinking of it in landscape, it's a longer rectangle than an 8x10. So
my question is, how do you compensate for that?
Crop it before you export it for printing. Crop it for whatever size you're going to have printed. So for instance, if you're going to have an 8x10 print made,
okay, I follow you.
Then crop it before you send it, or before you export it for printing, so that you're sure it will fit the format that you're printing.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, I got like about 10% of the men in the world, I'm colorblind. And as a consequence, I've all of that time I've been doing all this photography, I've been very averse to, I have no software, no anything for editing other than what the basic camera and computer have. And I'm wondering if there is any kind of an online source or a book of tricks that anybody's got, tips to, like, other than just basically sticking to black and white. My biggest concern is when I print something off of me that I think looks good, I'm in a minority.
Yeah. Yeah. The only trick I've heard is to work in black and white.
Follow the Ansel Adams route, eh?
Yeah. The other thing you can do, is don't edit your photos other than cropping and maybe brightness, but don't edit the color. Just assume that the camera knows better than you.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. The biggest problem out there is that, like, as I said, there's like 10% of the men in the world are colorblind, and most of those don't know it.
Yeah.
So I can help you out with that. There is a photographer that talks to our group now and then,
Yep.
Nathan St. Andre. He is also colorblind.
Okay.
So talk to him, Nathan, Nathan, St. Andre, Standre. He's got a website. He sells things. He does the art fair things and stuff like that. And actually did a presentation for us, I think last year on luminosity masks and things like that in Photoshop.
Okay.
He's able to overcome that color blindness somehow. I don't know if it's that he asks his wife or what, but I think you may want to reach out to him and see what he does or what tips he could give to you.
That's good. Appreciate that.
Yeah, he's another one who's colorblind.
But if I just type that to Google his name, I should be able to get it, eh?
Yeah, because I think his website is Saint Andre Photography or something like that.
Good.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can't keep chatting if we need to.